April 25, 1974. Lisbon, Portugal. It is 4:33 in the morning when Radio Renascença broadcasts a band song, Grandola, Vila Morena by José Afonso, a song so subversive that its very transmission was the signal. The signal for what? Only a few hundred people in the whole country knew. Within hours, armored vehicles were rolling through the streets of the Portuguese capital. They surrounded the headquarters of the secret police. They blocked the main roads. They parked outside the Carmo barracks, where Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano had taken refuge, and waited. And when Caetano finally surrendered, ending 48 years of authoritarian dictatorship in a revolution that would become famous for its carnations, for the flowers that civilians placed in the gun barrels of the soldiers who refused to fire on them, it was in one of those armored vehicles that he was driven to the airport and flown into exile. The vehicles that overthrew the Portuguese dictatorship had been built to protect it. They had been fighting its colonial wars across 3 continents for 7 years. They were named after a Portuguese military victory over an African emperor, and the blueprints from which they had been built had been stolen from an American company by 2 engineers who were later prosecuted for the theft. Their name was Chaimite, and their story is the most ironic in the history of the armored vehicle. To understand why the Chaimite existed, you need to understand the position Portugal found itself in by the early 1960s. The Estado Novo regime of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar had been in power since 1933, a right-wing authoritarian state that controlled speech, banned opposition parties, and ran what it called an overseas empire across Africa and Asia. By 1961, that empire was in open revolt. The African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde had begun armed operations in Portuguese Guinea. The Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola launched its uprising in Angola. The Mozambique Liberation Front, Frelimo, would follow in 1964. Portugal was now fighting 3 simultaneous colonial wars across 3 separate continents, with an army that had been designed for European border defense and not for counterinsurgency across thousands of kilometers of African bush. The equipment gap was acute. Portuguese forces were using Second World War-era vehicles, Daimler Dingo scout cars, Fox armored cars, American M5 Stuart light tanks dating back to 1942, against insurgents equipped with modern Soviet weapons. These antiques were inadequate and embarrassing. Portugal needed modern armored vehicles urgently, and Portugal's NATO allies, who officially disapproved of the colonial wars even as they privately allowed the use of alliance equipment in them, were not going to provide them openly. The solution came from an unlikely direction. Cadillac Gage of Warren, Michigan, had been building armored vehicles for the United States Army and its allies since the 1950s. Their V-100 Commando was a compact, capable 4x4 wheeled armored personnel carrier that had been adopted by the U.S. military and numerous export customers. Portuguese defense officials had seen it and wanted it. The American government, under political pressure not to be seen openly arming a colonial power, declined to approve an export license. What happened next became the subject of a congressional hearing in Washington in 1977. 2 former Cadillac Gage employees had been prosecuted and convicted for illegally transferring the technical knowledge for the Commando design to Bravia, a Portuguese vehicle manufacturer. The blueprints, in effect, had been stolen. Bravia used them as the foundation for what would become the Chaimite, making modifications and improvements that were substantial enough to produce a distinct vehicle, but the ancestry was unmistakable. The V-200, the primary variant, carried 11 soldiers and was armed with a .5 Browning heavy machine gun. It rode on 4 wheels with all-wheel drive, a diesel engine producing 155 horsepower, a top speed of 99 km per hour, and full amphibious capability. The armor stopped 7.62mm rounds across all angles. The first prototype appeared in 1966. The first units reached the field in 1967. The name they gave it carried its own history. Chaimite was the name of a sacred fortified village in Mozambique that had been the capital of the Gaza Empire, an independent African kingdom that had dominated southern Africa for much of the 19th century. In December 1895, a Portuguese cavalry officer named Muzinho de Albuquerque had ridden into Chaimite with a small force, captured the Gaza Emperor Ngungunyane, known as the Lion of Gaza, and broken the empire. It was one of the defining moments of Portuguese colonial mythology, the capture of the last great African king who had defied Lisbon. Bravia's technicians, naming their vehicle for this event, were making a statement about what they expected it to do across 3 African colonies in the 1960s. The name that celebrated the conquest of Africa would now be driven back into Africa to suppress the Africans who wanted their countries back. The irony would only deepen over time. The Chaimite performed well in all 3 theaters. In Angola, in Mozambique, and in Guinea-Bissau, it gave Portuguese forces the mobility they had lacked. It could move through the bush at speeds that Frelimo and PIGC fighters struggled to match. Its amphibious capability let it cross rivers that had previously required bridging or fording. The cavalry squadrons that operated it combined Chaimites with Panhard AML-60 armored cars to create fast, mobile reaction forces that could respond to insurgent activity across large areas. The first prototype, sent to Guinea-Bissau in 1968, performed well in combat trials before being destroyed by PIGC fighters with an RPG. Production accelerated. By the time the colonial wars ended, over 600 had been manufactured. Variants multiplied: the V-200 personnel carrier, the V-600 mortar carrier, the V-400 with a 90mm gun turret, the V-500 anti-tank variant, the V-800 ambulance, the V-900 recovery vehicle. The Chaimite became the backbone of Portuguese colonial armored warfare. It was also grinding the Portuguese army into exhaustion. By 1974, Portugal was committing 40% of its national budget to maintaining 3 colonial wars simultaneously. A generation of Portuguese officers had spent their careers in African bush instead of advancing through NATO staff positions in Europe. The armed forces were angry, the country was tired, and on April 25, 1974, the movement of the armed forces, junior and middle-ranking officers who had had enough of the colonial wars, launched the coup that would become the Carnation Revolution. The Chaimites that rolled through Lisbon in the early hours of April 25 came primarily from the Cavalry School at Santarém. The revolutionary units positioned their vehicles at key points across the capital. The PD, the secret police, watched from their headquarters as Chaimites surrounded their building, and their ability to respond to the coup evaporated with the dawn. At the Largo do Carmo, the Chaimites waited outside the barracks where Prime Minister Caetano had taken refuge. When General Spinola arrived to receive the surrender, Caetano's condition was specific. He would surrender to Spinola personally rather than to the crowd outside, so that power would pass to another military officer rather than dissolve into the street. He was then placed inside a Chaimite and driven to the military airfield at Figo Maduro, from which he flew into exile in Brazil. The vehicle that had been built to extend Portuguese colonial power in Africa had just ended Portuguese colonial power at home. The armored car, named for the capture of an African king, had transported the last prime minister of the regime that had done the capturing into permanent exile. Outside Portugal, the Chaimites' career continued. Lebanon's internal security forces had taken 30 V-200 vehicles in 1972. By April 1975, when the Lebanese Civil War began, 21 had been delivered. During the Battle of the Hotels in October 1975, ISF Chaimites helped evacuate more than 200 civilians, tourists, staff, and residents, trapped in the Holiday Inn and adjoining hotels in the Minat El Hosta district of Beirut, operating alongside Lebanese Army M13s and Panhard M3s in one of the war's early humanitarian operations. When the ISF collapsed in January 1976, Christian militias seized an unspecified number of the vehicles. The Guardians of the Cedars later used them against the Syrian army at the Battle for Zala in 1981. A single Chaimite supplied by Libya to the Palestinian Liberation Organization was captured by the IDF in the Bekaa Valley in 1982. The Philippines took 20 vehicles and used them for internal security. Peru acquired 32 for its Marine Corps. Libya kept 16 for presidential guard duties. The stolen blueprints of a Michigan vehicle manufacturer had produced an armored car that turned up on almost every contested corner of the Cold War world. Portugal held on to its Chaimites long after the empire was gone. The vehicles deployed to Bosnia and Kosovo with Portuguese peacekeeping forces in the 1990s. They served on NATO operations into the 2000s. The last operational Chaimites were finally retired from the Portuguese army in 2016, 49 years after the first units had reached Angola. The V-200, designated MX-5743, is on display at the Museu do Combatente in Lisbon's Forte do Bom Sucesso. Another stands at the Military Museum of Elvas. One Chaimites is part of the monument to the 25th of April in Póvoa de Varzim, the colonial war vehicle permanently installed as a symbol of the revolution that ended the war it was built to fight. April 25, 1974. Lisbon, a band song on the radio. Carnations and gun barrels. An armored car named for a Portuguese colonial victory, carrying the last prime minister of a colonial dictatorship into exile. The Chaimite was built from stolen blueprints. It fought 3 wars simultaneously across 3 continents. It protected the dictatorship that sent it to those wars, and then it drove that dictatorship out of power in a single morning. No armored vehicle in the history of warfare has a stranger or more complete story than that. The Lion of Gaza's name on a vehicle that ended the regime that had captured him. That is not irony. That is history finishing its own sentence.